Good evening. Welcome to Stygian Articles presented by the Lovecraft Tapes podcast. Hello, Mama Cryptid. You are just in time. And I am Jeremy, your keeper of arcane lore. And tonight I'm going to read horror fiction for you. Listener discretion is advised. The scary stories I read and write will sometimes contain extreme horror, violence, language, and other adult themes. No erotica, sorry, Mama Cryptid. Watch and listen at your own risk. And tonight's tale I've lined up for you is going to be a two-parter. I'm going to read part one tonight, and then in 1 week I'll finish up the story. And this is a short story, actually a rather long story, called Ghosts in Okemos, written by me. And this is essentially a first draft. It's gotten a little bit of a rewrite, but it definitely needs some work. So I hope you like it. We'll see how this goes. Ghosts in Okemos. No one in the Okemos Sheriff's Office could be called more rooted, more down to earth than Deputy Sam Randall. So it came as a shock to him when he started seeing ghosts. Not quite the pale white floating blobs with evil grins or dark shapes howling in eternal anguish. Those were reserved for lousy movies and comic books. No, the ghosts in the old police station kept to the periphery of your eye. They flitted in the unlit corners of the cells. They scurried across the bathroom floor like roaches when Sam knew goddamn well there were no bugs in the building. Occasionally, they would shut a file cabinet drawer or slam a barred door. He had once brought in a level from his woodshop at home to make sure no slope caused these minor spooks. Everything checked out okay. Nobody else at the office, Sheriff Riggs, Susie, Mike, or the cleaning lady, ever mentioned they saw anything weird. Even when a book Sam had been reading minutes before fell from a shelf, when he knew he'd set it snugly back into place, Susie just gave him a sour look and got up from her typewriter to put it back. Oh, there had been other things too, but his coworkers either ignored the occurrences or just blamed old Sammy. Old Sammy knew otherwise. The building was haunted by ghosts. So he'd done some research. Seems the kind of unexplained phenomenon he'd witnessed could be caused by something called a poltergeist. According to the books, poltergeists might be a single entity or collective of dead spirits tied to one place for eternity, condemned to haunt the living in that same location. Some of the books claimed you could drive off the poltergeist by consecrating ground, have a priest sprinkle holy water and recite blessings. He snorted. The sheriff would have his ass if Sam showed up to work one day with a Bible thumper at his side. No, for the most part, if you discounted those horrible movies, poltergeists were harmless. Still, it didn't comfort him as he sat alone at the station Wednesday night, staring into his dark cup of cooling coffee, waiting for Mike to report back on a disturbance over near the campus. The building around him seemed to crowd, leaning in closer as if to hear his every word. He kept his mouth shut and tried to concentrate on paperwork. Wednesday nights were the worst. He couldn't blame Sheriff Riggs for saddling him with the duty, though. Sheriff often spent all day Saturday and most Sundays here without a word of complaint. Sammy insisted, barring any real emergencies, on having Sundays off. Not for church or anything. He just needed the stability of having that one day off, like clockwork. He would get up late, drink coffee, read the papers, and maybe go out and catch a movie or go shopping. It was like recharging his batteries. When he came in the next Monday, he felt ready for anything. But by Wednesday, a block of ice settled in his gut. He hated these loner shifts. After he got through them, everything was fine. During, the minutes stretched away into infinity while the radio droned at the front desk and the darkness seeped in no matter how many lights he turned on. Maybe it's my age, he thought. I'm getting too old and jittery for this job. That was pure bullshit, and he knew it. Nobody else at this office could outdraw him, and earlier this year, he'd single-handedly broken up a bar fight between two football players at one of the local college bars. And those kids could throw a mean punch. He'd taken one to the ribs as he stepped between them, but he was in good shape. The bruise cleared up in a couple months. The kids got expelled from the university. No, law enforcement flowed in his bloodstream. He had been meant for this job. Something fell and shattered on the floor in the kitchen. Sam leaned back from his desk, dropping his pen atop the piles of complaint forms. He glanced to the clock on the wall. 1:33. Was that all? Sunup was still hours away. Maybe Mike had come in the back door. Possum? That you? Sheriff had given Mike the nickname after the young deputy rescued one from a rabbit trap. Silence, cold and secret, answered. Sam got up from his chair, unsnapping the holster at his side. Never paid to be too careful. He walked slowly to the kitchen. A coffee cup lay in big shards on the floor next to the far wall. One of the pieces read, "World's Greatest," and another said simply, "Mom." Susie's mug. Boy, would she be pissed tomorrow. Old Sammy would get the blame, as usual. Grunting, he knelt to pick up the sharp chunks, noting that the coffee cup rack on the counter, where Susie always hung her mug, stood clear across the room. When he'd done cleaning, Sam remained motionless in the center of the room, listening. The tick of a faraway clock came to him, along with the persistent hiss of the radio. He could barely hear night traffic on the highway just a quarter mile away, mostly truckers. But underneath all that, he thought he detected something else. Another layer of sound buried beneath the everyday cacophony. If he only listened long enough and hard enough. There. Someone spoke. Oh, it didn't sound intelligible, more like a constant chanting of nonsense. The sub-whisper seemed as if it wanted to make sense. It strained toward meaning with a sense of urgency. It wanted to be heard, and it wanted old Sammy to hear it. Sam shook his head. This was getting crazy, standing like a statue in the kitchen trying to hear a ghost. He forced himself to concentrate on the regular noises of the office, then sat back down to finish his paperwork. As he picked up his pen, he saw his entire right arm crawled with goose flesh. He filled out a form, then reached for his coffee. His hand closed on empty air. Frowning, he looked up from the desk. His cup had disappeared. In its place, a ring of coffee stain remained. He stared out at the empty office, half expecting to see either Mike holding the mug with an impish grin on his face, or the coffee cup floating in midair. He saw neither. Another smashing sound. This time, it came from the back room, where the cells brooded in the dark. And after that, something resembling a deep, earthy chuckle. Oh God, this is where I buy it, Sam thought. The dumbass deputy in those horror movies always buys it when he goes to investigate. This is the part where I say, hello? Is there anybody there? He called out to the waiting darkness. He meant it to be ironic, but it came out too querulous. How long am I going to sit here and pretend there's nothing going on? He had two options. Wait for Mike, who might be out patrolling until sunrise, or check out the disturbance. Before he realized he'd even made a choice, he strolled toward the back room, one hand on his gun butt. Sweat trickled along his ribs. This shit was definitely for the birds. Darkness engulfed the cell block, and there was a particular smell altogether different than the usual drunk vomit or piss. It had an electric quality to it, like before a lightning storm. He reached out and flipped the light switch. The fluorescence kicked on overhead. Of course, the cells were empty. Sam squatted onto his haunches, peering under the bunks. Nobody. There were pieces of ceramic scattered along the floor in the last cell. That damn ghost again. And his favorite coffee cup, too. Sighing, he fetched the broom and dustpan again, then opened the cell door to clean up the mess. As soon as his back was turned, the cell door slammed shut. Nice try, he said, still sweeping, but I got the keys. He jangled them for emphasis, though the sound reminded him of old Marley wrapped in chains. The lights went out. Fuck me, Sam whispered. He dropped the broom and took out the keys. Which one? He couldn't see. Feeling blind, he began trying each of the keys in the lock, one by one, careful to move in one direction on the ring and mindful not to drop the whole ring, else start again. His palms were sweaty as he tried not to look into the waiting blackness. Something began moving down the corridor toward his cell. "Mike, that you?" No answer. The approaching footfalls somehow sounded sloppy, as if the person were wading through mud or dragging misshapen feet. That subliminal chanting began to get louder. Sam slowly backed away from the door, pulling his sidearm out of the holster and pointing it at the thick dark. Something stopped in front of the cell. A bit of moonlight came through the tiny window set high in the cell block wall, illuminating the intruder. Sam felt his mouth go dry and his eyes start from his head in shock. His gun hand shook. Almost of its own accord, his trigger finger began convulsing, snapping off shot after shot at the thing. After the gunshot echoes died, the cell door opened quietly and darkness came for him. Sheila never liked Okemos much. Mostly snobby people living off the wealth trickling down from the nearby university. High-paid administrators and tenured professors with doctorates decorating their office walls. They worked in East Lansing, but scurried back to the womb of Okemos, where students couldn't get at them, where real life couldn't touch them. Not like her. She preferred to live and breathe among the throngs of young people, their search for knowledge and purpose, a balm to the predictable madness of history repeating itself, Ouroboros, snake eating its tail. The students represented hope for a different future, a better day. Despite her prejudice toward the adjacent township, when the police asked for her help with an unnatural occurrence, she couldn't refuse. It's what she did. That, and taught medieval literature. Sheriff Riggs waited for her on the steps of the station. He stood barrel-chested and solid, the effects of too much sun spotting his skin with dark blotches that might soon turn to skin cancer. His kind brown eyes held a glint of steel. As she got out of the car and went to shake his hand, she felt an immediate respect for this once football player. "Miss Halsey, I presume?" He favored her with a warm but controlled smile. No teeth. "It's Miss," she replied, "but please call me Sheila." He nodded. "Come inside. I got coffee brewing." As they went into the station, Sheila noted an unusual scent in the air, like ozone or an electrical appliance on the fritz. Riggs led her through the main office where an older woman typed solemnly, not even looking up as they passed. A gold nameplate on the desk read, Suzanne Deloche. The steady clacking of typewriter keys sounded anachronistic. An unused computer sat on the desk next to the woman. Riggs motioned her to sit down at the kitchen table, then poured 2 cups of strong-looking black coffee into styrofoam cups. He lifted his eyebrows and gestured at the shakers of powdered cream and sugar. She shook her head. He smiled and handed her a cup. Hope you like it, he said, sitting. Roasted the beans myself. Kind of a hobby. Sheila sipped and murmured appreciatively. Strong. Good. She took another sip, allowing the aroma to fill her lungs, feeling the caffeine opening her senses. Riggs sat quietly, patiently waiting for her to begin. It always started this way, but she marveled at how easily the tables turned. The police, ordinarily interrogators, almost docilely, almost docilely accepting the mantle of interviewee. Maybe some of them got a kick out of it. She put down her coffee and fished out a notepad and pen from her satchel. Uh, Over the phone, you said something unusual happened here last night. To one of your deputies? Yep, he said. Something unusual, all right. I called over to the state police. They recommended I call you. Where is your deputy now? Sheila glanced back into the office. Well, I sent Mike home after patrol. He was the one who found Sammy. Shook that kid up pretty bad. The sheriff looked into his coffee. Shook me up, too. She scratched down names. Mike, Sammy. Drew an arrow between them. So, Sammy pulled graveyard shift last night? Riggs nodded. Yeah, he did it so he could have Sundays free. A little deal we had. No big thing. We're a small operation. Don't get too much in the way of criminal activity out here. Except maybe the occasional drive-by wine tasting, Sheila thought. What makes you think this had anything to do with the supernatural? A call came over the radio in the next room. Susie rushed to answer it, and the sheriff kept an eye on her until she gave him a headshake. Nothing urgent then. Sorry, he said. Two things come to mind. One, old Sammy had been talking about ghosts the past couple months. He'd read books about them and everything. Even tried to tell us he'd seen things in this station at night. Of course, we didn't think much of his stories, figured his imagination ran away. What was the second thing? Sheila asked. He shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Well, when we found him sitting in that cell, he was scared out of his mind. The door stood wide open, but he cowered on the bunk like a whipped dog. His hair had turned completely white, even the little hairs on his arms. But his eyes were the worst. Sheila leaned in closer. What about his eyes? The sheriff looked up at her, sorrow and disgust twisting his features ever so slightly. Whatever he saw last night, he made sure he'd never have to look at anything so frightening again. Susie, in the next room, stopped typing. We told the press he'd had a breakdown. They bought it for now. There'll be more questions later. Show me the cell, please, Sheila said. Riggs led her out of the kitchen, back through the office toward a reinforced door. Susie tracked them with her eyes as they passed. Beyond the door, a thin hallway stretched to the back of the building, lined with jail cells on the left. One of the cage doors stood open. That electrical smell hung heavy in the air here. Sheila followed the officer. Every cell measured approximately 7 feet square, walls bricked up and floors set with large field stones. Not at all like the modern jails with their gray concrete on all sides. The iron bars looked plenty solid. In Okemos, they most likely contained drunk students wandering too far from campus on a night of binge drinking. We're looking to remodel in a year or two, but we don't get much business, Riggs confirmed as if reading her mind. Drunks mostly. Every now and again, we might provide lodging for offenses such as shoplifting, jaywalking, or loitering. Not much action. No one here last night, other than Sam? He shook his head and motioned to the open door. Inside, congealed blood spattered the gray floor. Sheila went in. A shiver rippled through her. Riggs saw it. Cold? They say haunted places often have cold spots, she said, returning his gaze. His face remained unreadable. You believe that? She shrugged. Doesn't matter what I believe. Let's stick to the facts for now. Up high on the outer wall, a tiny barred window peeked out at the early morning. If you stood on the single bunk, you might be able to pull yourself up enough to look outside. And if you could wrap something around those bars, like a belt or a bed sheet wound tight. Has anyone ever committed suicide here? Hanged themselves? The sheriff staggered slightly back, as if he'd been sucker punched. Good God, no. What kind of department do you think I... When did you come on this job? She interrupted. About 11 years ago, I guess. Hugh O'Keefe had it before me. I hear he was a good old boy. Sheila nodded. Yeah, I know of O'Keefe. The former sheriff of Okemos had been legendary in his corruption a couple decades ago, when he'd held office in Red Hook, New York. Racist, vicious, and elbow deep in such worthwhile activities as gun running, racketeering, and the black market. She remembered his fall from grace when the FBI began investigating him, but they'd never been able to pin anything directly to the fat, overly jolly politician. And then, thanks to the media moving on to the next big thing, the story disappeared beneath the waves of rhetoric. She vaguely recalled O'Keefe had wormed his way out of prosecution by abandoning his political office and taking a lowly civil servant's position somewhere far away from Red Hook. Had he wound up as sheriff of Okemos? Seemed likely at this point. She made a mental note to check it out later. Do you keep records of all cases that pass through here? She asked. Yep, he acknowledged. Though, we haven't quite got around to putting everything in the computer yet. Susie's working on that right now. Sheila stooped and stared at the bloody smears on the floor. I can't be sure, but Sammy's mishap last night might have had something to do with a bad thing that happened in this cell. Could you have Susie go through the old records before your time as sheriff and weed out any reports of suspicious deaths, especially any taking place on this spot? Sure, I guess. He seemed doubtful. Look, she said. This is just a starting place, okay? It might not mean anything, but we've got to check it out. Tell her to look very carefully at the reports during O'Keefe's tenure. Sometimes you have to read between the lines to get at the truth. He searched her eyes. You really think it's going to help? It's not going to change what happened last night, but I think we can prevent it from happening again. She stood and moved closer to him. He blocked the exit, hands on hips. She felt him judging her, trying to figure her out, attempting to determine if she was just putting him on. Patiently, she waited. All right, he said at last, moving aside and casting his eyes downward. I'll get Susie started on that right away. Sheila moved out into the narrow corridor, feeling she could breathe again. Thanks, she said. I'll need to talk to Mike first, and then I'll go over to the hospital to visit Sam. Can I call you later this evening? Yep, he said in a forlorn voice. I'll be here at the station. As she left with the phone numbers and addresses Riggs gave her, Sheila noticed Susie typing away at a frenzied pace while staring blankly at Sam's empty desk. Something nagged the back of her brain. Some tidbit of information she should recall, but which remained sunken in her skull like some half-buried treasure awaiting discovery by an old beachcomber armed with a metal detector. It had something to do with O'Keefe, she knew that much. A trip to the campus library would be necessary. Maybe after questioning Mike. She tracked down the off-duty deputy at his favorite watering hole, the Peanut Barrel, located across from the university. After class drinks, and for some before class, did brisk business for the grungy establishment. The barrel became legendary for the peanut shells scattered on the floor, the 2-drink limit on Long Island iced teas, and Pink Floyd on the jukebox. Mostly the older crowd hung out here, or those looking for an escape from the rest of the world. Dark, dank, the Peanut Barrel reeked of anachronism. Sheila went in through the heavy oak door and immediately spotted Mike. Dark hair, pale skin, tall and thin, kind of slouching. He still wore his uniform, unbuttoned at the collar, and his badge tucked away. 3 empty glasses sat on the table, while he clutched a 4th half empty with some dark amber liquid. Strains of Shine On Crazy Diamond drifted from the battered juke at the back of the bar. Mike's free hand weaved through the air as if conducting the music or following its trail. His eyes were clamped shut. Mike Carter? He looked at her. Tendrils of thin red spider webs emanated from his blue-green irises. She saw he'd been crying earlier. Couldn't blame him. Yeah? His tone was guarded, not rude, but not open either. Mind if I join you? Before he could answer, she sat in the chair opposite him and pulled out her notepad. He stared at her mistrustfully. You some kind of reporter? No, she said. I'm here to help Sheriff Riggs with the investigation of what happened last night. My name is Sheila Helsing. I just want to ask you a few questions. His grip tightened on the glass. As you can see, Sheila, by these dead soldiers on the table, I'm trying to forget last night. He paused, looking at her carefully. Wait a minute. You're that Sheila Helsing? The one from a few years back in the papers? She nodded. Holy shit, he whispered. With a trembling hand, he put down the drink and wiped a sleeve across his mouth. Sorry about that. I guess being a deputy is maybe too suspicious. It's fine, Mike. I just need you to answer a few questions and I'll go. He put on a half-drunken, sheepish grin. Could I ask you something first? Sure, she sighed, pen poised above her notepad. So, demons? Really? Really, she said. But I think we're dealing with ghosts this time around. That's what Sam thought, right? Ghosts? Mike nodded vigorously. Exactly. He was always reading some Time Life book or something. He kept saying we had a poltergeist at the station. Did you ever see anything unusual happen? No, but at night, sometimes there'd be this weird humming sound from back by the cells. We even had a few of our overnighters complain about it. Figured it was just a lamppost outside. Sometimes those phosphorescent bulbs get to buzzing. He took a sip of his drink. You want one? No, thank you. Anything else strange? Have other prisoners reported supernatural activity? Maybe, he admitted. I never paid that talk any mind until today. I mean, shit, you get these kids or vagrants hopped up on who knows what, and they'll be seeing Lee Harvey Oswald floating above their beds in the middle of the night. She rubbed her chin. Point taken. Anyway, if anyone had reported something, it'd be in the files back at the office. Okay, I'll check that out a little later. Sheila paused, watching him closely for any reaction. Now, tell me about finding Sam. Mike cringed. His eyelids reflexively closed and he took a deep breath. Angrily, he slammed the near-empty cup on the table. This shit ain't working with a damn. Limited to my ass. He looked at her, embarrassed. Sorry. Not a problem. Take your time. She saw him visibly reel in his emotions, tightening the facade until a stoic, weary deputy sat in front of her again. On the jukebox, the same song started from the beginning. Glasses clinked from behind the bar, where a haggard-looking woman prepared for the lunch crowd that would be filing in soon. Beneath the smell of broken peanut shells and frying burgers, she detected the cloying scent of old vomit. I came back from patrol at 5, he began. Just before dawn. Nothing much happened last night. A couple of fights, a couple of disturbances. It'll be much worse next month when the football crowd comes into town. So I get back to the station, and first thing I notice, Sammy isn't at his desk drinking coffee like he always does. You can count on that, Sammy drinking coffee at his desk. His breath hitched as if he might sob, but he kept going instead. I called out for him, thinking he was just in the John or getting supplies. I knew he wouldn't be out back in the jail because we didn't have any visitors that night. Then I heard it. Sheila stopped writing. She squinted at him. You mean the buzzing sound? No, he shook his head. It was different. A kind of mewling, like a kitten caught in a bear trap. He shivered. It kind of froze me in place. Stupid, I know. We're supposed to be brave and all that. Police officers, I mean, but it just stopped me in my tracks. Got goosebumps just thinking about it. And the sound was coming from the cell block. Well, I called out for Sammy again. No answer. I forced myself to walk to the hallway, thinking I was just being stupid. But there was really a cat or raccoon trapped in the back. I opened the door and tried the light switch. No go. So I got out my flashlight to search the cells. By then, that weird mewling had stopped. Mike downed the rest of his drink. I found him in the third cell, curled up like a baby on the bunk. The door was wide open. I said his name again, and he sat up like one of those, what do you call them, puppets? Marionettes? Like he had strings attached to him. Mikey, he says, help me. And he comes at me, and I could see his hair has turned white all the way down to the roots. And his eyes are gone. At first, I thought something had been at him, like an animal or something, tore out his eyes. Then I noticed his hands are covered with blood and some jelly stuff. And there's splotches of red on the floor. Well, I guess I dragged him out of there pretty fast and called an ambulance. Then the sheriff. The whole time, Sammy is sitting quiet at his desk like he's calm. His hands, though, they were busy. Scrambling around on his desktop like he was looking for something. Just before they took him away, he asked me, have you seen my coffee mug? Fucking creepy. The jukebox went silent. Sheila put her pen and paper away. Mike stared at the bottom of his empty glass. They sat quietly for a few moments. Then she stood up and put out her hand. He took it reluctantly. His fingers felt like cold fish. Are you going to figure this thing out? He asked. She shrugged. I hope so. If you think of anything else, leave a message at the station. I'll pick it up later tonight. He nodded, already signaling the bartender for another of those amber concoctions. Sheila slung her satchel over one shoulder and departed. All right, guys, that's it for tonight. That is part 1 of Ghosts and Okemos. Next week, I'll read the end to that. Let me know what you think, if you dug it, if you hate it, whatever. I know it's a little rough, it needs some work, but it was kind of fun doing all those voices, so. Tune in next time for another installment of Stygian Articles. Thank you for spending time with me. If you've enjoyed this dark fiction, please visit StygianArticles.com for more of my spooky stories, and LovecraftTapes.com for fresh episodes of our Call of Cthulhu actual play podcast, which will be starting up in a couple weeks. Case 14. I'm Jeremy, your keeper of arcane lore, wishing you sweet dreams. Good night. Thanks, Mama. Hey, Toph. I will see you guys tomorrow for Double Vision.